Well, good morning. My name is Zinnia Willits, and I am the Executive Director of the Southeastern Museums Conference. A warm welcome to all our members joining today from across our region, and a special welcome to all those from across the country, wow, who may be new to SEMC. SEMC is a regional professional organization representing museums and museum professionals in the 12 southeastern states, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. We have a membership of around 1,500 and continue to grow. I will take this moment to point out that we are running a membership special next week where new, renewing, or lapsed members can join SEMC for 40% off our regular member rates. Now is a great time to join as we continue to adjust our operations and programming to truly meet the moment and provide opportunities for networking, genuine connection, and peer-to-peer discussion, such as the timely conversation we are going to have today. I'm thrilled that SEMC has organized today's program, Deaccessioning Myths, Misconceptions, and Missed Opportunities, in partnership with the Southeastern Art Museum Directors Consortium. This group of over 100 museum directors from art museums across the Southeast has been in existence for many years to share resources and information and to provide an informal network of conversation and leadership support. For almost a year now, bi-weekly Zoom meetings have kept this group connected and offered an opportunity to discuss the current events, issues, successes, and challenges museums have faced during a very difficult year. The floor is always open for discussion, and deaccessioning has been on the agenda more than once, which led to this opportunity for the wider discussion we are offering today. Before we get to introductions, I did want to say a quick thank you to the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation for the significant support they have provided SEMC over this past year to make these programs possible. We will offer monthly SEMC programs throughout 2021, and support is greatly appreciated to help cover costs related to producing a virtual program. Speaking of support, a huge thank you to Banks Creative Studio out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, today's program sponsor. Banks Creative has been responsible for SEMC's virtual look this past year, designing new logos, virtual backgrounds, and promotional graphics for all of our virtual programs. Thank you to Banks Creative. Excuse me. So just a few basic housekeeping notes before I introduce our panel. This session is being recorded and will be available on SEMC's YouTube channel just as soon as I can get it up. Closed captioning is available for today's program. You can turn it on via the CC button at the bottom of your screen, or you will be able to in just a minute. Sometimes there is a delay. A written transcript of today's session will also be available just as soon as we can get it edited. I'm certain there will be many questions for our panel, and we have built in a good amount of time after the roundtable discussion for speakers to answer questions, and I encourage you all to put them in the Q&A box so that we can keep track and address them at the end. While this is a Zoom webinar and we have our cameras off, you are still here, and I encourage you all to speak freely and engage with your colleagues in the chat, which will not be captured in the recording. While C in the SEMC stands for conference, it also stands for community, today, tomorrow, and always, and it's so nice to see all of you here. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. In the interest of time, I'll keep the intros brief, but I am going to drop a link to each speaker's full bio in the chat in just a moment. I'm thrilled to have such accomplished leaders with us this morning to take on the topic of deaccessioning, and I hope you will take a moment to read their backgrounds. First, we have today's moderator, Dr. Jill Deupi, who is the Beaux Arts Director and Chief Curator of the Lowe Art Museum at the University of Miami. Prior to assuming this position in 2014, Jill was Director and Chief Curator of University Museums at Fairfield University in Connecticut, where she was also an Assistant Professor of Art History. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Dahl, who very recently retired in July 2020 as Director of the Weatherspoon Art Museum at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, after 22 years of service in that position. Nancy came to the Weatherspoon from Santa Barbara, California, where she was the executive director of the Contemporary Arts Forum and a curator of modern and contemporary art at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Erik Neal, who has been the director of the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia since 2014. Erik began directing museums in 1999 when he started as the director of the Newcomb Art Gallery of Tulane University. Please also welcome Robin Nicholson, an art museum strategic consultant based in Richmond, Virginia, who has served in leadership roles at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the Frick Pittsburgh, and the Telfair Museums in Savannah, Georgia. Robin also has additional experience in the for-profit and gallery worlds. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Daniel Stetson, the executive director of the Louisiana State Museum of Art in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Before coming to LSU in 2016, Daniel served as executive director of the Hunter Museum of American Art in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And prior to that, he was the executive director of the Polk Museum of Art in Lakeland, Florida for nearly 15 years. A huge thank you to all of you for being with us today and sharing your thoughts and experiences with the practice of deaccessioning, a tricky topic that has made national headlines multiple times over this past year. On behalf of SCMC, we are so pleased to offer today's program that will feature a roundtable discussion led by those who represent institutions with different collections, different budget sizes, and perhaps different deaccessioning philosophies and practices than the same few museums we seem to read about every other day. According to the Deaccession Toolbox website put together by AAM's Deaccession Task Force, deaccessioning is a regular part of collections management. It is considered good practice when the process follows professionally accepted ethical and legal standards. And that seems like a good place for me to turn it over to you, Jill.
Thank you, Zinnia, and good morning to everyone out there in Zoomlandia, wherever you are. Thanks for taking time out of your day to be with us. A special thanks to Zinnia and her team, to SEMC, to SEAMD, to the aforementioned sponsors, and of course to my co-panelists. I'm really happy to be having this conversation with all of you today. We have a lot to cover in a fairly limited amount of time since it is such a meaty topic. So I want to dig right in. But first, I think it's really important to think about terminology and shared understandings. These are critical tools, I think, for any meaningful and productive conversation. I suspect that most in the audience today understand what we mean when we use the word deaccessioning. But just to be sure that we're all starting from the same place, I would like to offer a definition of this term, derived from Marie Malaro's seminal article, Deaccessioning, An American Perspective, which was first published in Museum Management and Curatorship back in 1990. Malaro defines deaccessioning as, quote, the permanent removal of an object that was once accessioned into a museum collection, end quote. This means that only works that have been formally added to an institution's permanent collection can be deaccessioned, something that is not true of loans, nor indeed any object that was acquired, but never formally accessioned. I would also like to note that deaccessioning is distinct from disposal, with the former necessarily preceding the latter. Put differently, you cannot appropriately dispose of an accessioned work, whether through sale, transfer, repatriation, restitution, destruction, or any other means, unless it has first been deaccessioned. With those baseline considerations in place, let's dig in. My first question is for you, Robin. Good morning. I think there's a general misconception that deaccessioning is in and of itself bad. This is of course inaccurate, as Zinnia alluded to in her opening remarks. Indeed, deaccessioning, when done properly, is a critically important tool for creating and maintaining healthy permanent collections. Can you please share your thoughts on the matter, including concrete examples from your own direct experience as the former director of both the Frick Pittsburgh and the Telfair?
Sure, Jill, I will. I mean, I think the understanding of deaccessioning has sort of expanded in, gosh, the last few months with everything that's been going on, and trying to understand exactly what the implications are for art museums that may be struggling financially. And obviously we've had the news about the Met in the last few days. Deaccessioning is part of the everyday operation of a museum. It happens with the advice of the registrars, the curators, the director. Any object that is going to be deaccessioned goes to a collections committee, goes to a board vote. So ultimately, it's all very transparent in terms of what is being deaccessioned and why it's being deaccessioned. And at any point in that process, there could be a decision to reverse that and say, well, no, actually, this object is important to us. But I think the big conversation at the moment is thinking about museum collections, where, as we all know, maybe 5–7% of the collection is on display at any one time and the rest is in storage. And is this the way that museums should be moving forward into the third decade of the 21st century in terms of thinking about what their mission is? And I think there needs to be a sort of substantial revision of the collections management policy. Is the museum really just an acquisition sort of factory that we buy art, we acquire art, we are given art, and we just store it? Is there a bigger mission, and should we be reconsidering the role of the collection in that? An interesting example, which I'll use in answer to your question, is when I was at the Frick in Pittsburgh, which is a museum that was established by Helen Clay Frick and primarily has collections of 17th to 19th century European art and Gilded Age objects and decorative arts. We had two Chinese vases in our collection, Imperial Ming Chinese vases, that had been acquired by Henry Clay Frick from Pierpont Morgan in the early part of the 20th century as decoration, essentially. He had them in his house in Massachusetts. They sat by the fireplace, and then came to the Frick in Pittsburgh subsequently. Those were the most valuable works in our collection. They were valued by Christie's at approximately $25 million a piece. And there was a strong impetus from some of our board that these don't really fit into the collection as such, other than they tell something of the story of the Fricks. What would $50 million do for us as an institution? And at the time I said, sorry, that's not a debate we're going to have. I would query now whether, if I was still at the Frick, whether I would actually reconsider that and say $50 million that could be invested in, I don't know, a chief curator endowment or an acquisition endowment. Would that be a good use of our collections in a more meaningful way for the museum than just having these two objects that don't really fit in particularly with the way we operate? And so I think that's a question a lot of museums are going to have and think about. Is it our role to be encyclopedic institutions, or try to be encyclopedic institutions, or should we be really refocusing the collections as a part of the overall mission of the museum and thinking about where does the collection take us? And should we just be seeing ourselves as something of a repository of works of art? Is there a bigger question there? I don't know, but I think that's something I've been thinking about a lot, and thinking that museums really need to focus on their collections policies and then make meaningful decisions about deaccessioning once they've got to that point. Deaccessioning shouldn't lead the decision-making. It should be collections that lead the decision-making, and deaccessioning is the follow-up to that thereafter.
Thank you very much. And that's the perfect segue to my next question, which I'd like to address to Nancy. Even healthy deaccessions can be fraught with missteps if not conducted appropriately, something to which Robin just alluded. To me, the most significant concern in this arena lies in using the balance sheet as a guide for determining what should be removed from a museum's collection. Expressed another way, there's a danger in thinking first of market value rather than the criteria of appropriate deaccessioning, as articulated in a specific museum's collection management policy, when considering future collection adjustments and refinements. I know, Nancy, that you have conducted a number of site visits on behalf of AAM's accreditation committee over the years, in addition to having served as UNC Greensboro's Weatherspoon Museum of Art Director for more than 2 decades. So I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on the intersection of the CMP, or collection management policy, and deaccessioning. I would equally welcome your views on when appraisals and fair market values and the like should appropriately be brought to bear to the collections, to these collection-related decisions.
Thank you, Jill. And good morning, everybody. Sorry, I just kicked over a trash can in my office. I can't agree with you more that there's a huge danger in putting market value above or a museum's financial situation to be used in determining what should be de-accession. And I just want to say briefly, in reading a wonderful book called Deaccessioning and its Discontents, A Critical History by Martin Gammon. I don't know if any of you know that, but it's a terrific overview of and history of deaccessioning. The term deaccession and deaccessioning, they didn't even exist in the English language before the 1940s and only came into really popular discourse in the 70s. And a lot of that happened because of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm just going to briefly tell this story since the Met is again in the news about deaccessioning. And that has to do with the Hoving affair, in which Thomas Hoving oversaw the anonymous sale and relatively secret sale of a number of important works in the collection, including a Picasso and an Ang, in order to buy the portrait of Juan de Pareja by Velázquez. As I said, they did so with no transparency. And another concerning point about that was that the Met used it as a branding mechanism to show how they were being inclusive to the minority communities that were kind of marshaling their forces against them at that time. So it was a clever bit of PR and disingenuous, safe, or maybe ingenuous face saving. But at the time, the move was supported by other major museums like the Guggenheim, MoMA, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and also by AAM. But to respond more to the rest of your question, I think the process for deaccessioning has to be articulated in a museum's collection policy. And that policy needs to go through the steps of what happens. That is, how the works to be deaccessioned are determined. Who does that? What will be the methods of disposal? Occasionally, museums transfer objects to another museum, but that's a pretty rare situation, unfortunately. Also, what is the rationale? Is it because works are no longer, or maybe never were, pertinent to the museum's mission? Maybe the mission became more clearly defined as the museum evolved. Sometimes a work or works are deaccessioned because a museum has holdings by a single artist, multiple holdings, and they might decide to dispose of some of the lesser works, keep the major works, but maybe the sketches or the, simple drawings, really more sketches, I would say, studies. So they might call out the most significant of that artist's work and decide to keep that, which I think is perfectly fine. I don't know how much more time I have, but I'll just say at the Weatherspoon Art Museum, we had an advisory board, and we would bring deaccessions, possible deaccessions, to them first, but really as a courtesy. The Weatherspoon has an unusual situation that in 1989, a private nonprofit foundation was set up to hold legal title to the collection. There's a long operating agreement with the university at that time, which transfers all of the holdings to the care and management of the professional museum staff. But so in the deaccessioning, the list has to be sent to or presented really to the foundation board, first to their executive committee and then to the board itself for approval. And, as I said, we provide the rationale for each and every object. We go through all the provenance research. We try to contact donors, we've gone as far as contacting grandchildren of donors just to do due diligence. So, you know, that's the procedure there. And I think it's one that's very well outlined in our collections management policy and in keeping with the kind of practice in the field, or the proper practice in the field.
Great. Thank you very much, Nancy. Erik, my next question is for you, and it relates to AAMD's April 2020 resolution, which slightly relaxed how member museums can use the proceeds realized from the sale of deaccession works from collections replenishment, that is to say, buying new works of art, to direct care of collections. This generated a fair amount of confusion and consternation in the months that followed. I do feel I need to disclose that I am an AAMD trustee and was privy to internal conversations that led to the promulgation of their resolution. But since I'm not an officer of the organization, I don't feel it would be appropriate for me to comment on the matter. I do, though, want to hear your thoughts, given that you are an active member of the organization, as well as, of course, the sitting director at the Chrysler with prior museum direction experience at other institutions as well. I would also welcome your views as to what you think is an appropriate future for the direct care question.
Well, I think as this has been playing out, there is this, we clearly see there's a huge loophole with the phrase direct care that has never been closed. I was reviewing the direct care of collections document from AAM, and they also punt on that document, and they say that, as Nancy was, I think, alluding to, you have to have a plan, you have an internal plan, but it's left up to the institutions to decide what that is. I think many museums that are not art museums are already using any funds that they have for direct care, and they have sorted that out, and that goes to the differentiation between art museums and the rest of the museum field. And that might be another topic, but I'll try to hone in a little bit on direct care. So I think many of us would say, okay, you sell your Eng, and you use those proceeds to buy another work of art. And you also might use it to buy a frame. You might use it to buy a mat. You might use it to care for that. And that has been the parameters. But the discussion now is certainly going beyond that. Certainly the document that AAMD talked about, and we'll maybe talk about this a little bit more, went well beyond direct care to operational, which is making people like me a little uneasy. And but I think we ought to go a little bit further into what do we mean. So first of all, some people say, well, pay for a conservator. Maybe pay for a conservator's salary. And I could see that. You could see that justification. Would it pay for an HVAC system? Because, you know, I've got this great collection of color photography and I need to have refrigerated space. I think that's direct care. I'm not sure that we all start getting very uncomfortable with that. So what I'm saying is, I don't think I have the answer right now, but I do think that it is incumbent upon AAMD and maybe art museums. And remember, AAMD is, I don't know, a couple hundred members, 250 members, and SEMC has 1,500 members. There are many more museums that are out there than who are represented by AAMD. I think that's another topic that I would broach, that things that happen at AAMD then have this ripple effect out there. But what I would say, things that I have been talking to myself about, who is deciding what direct care is? Do you have a process? What are your specifics? Did you make your plan? We all, to be accredited, we all AAM accredited museums have to have a plan. But I'd like people to think for a second about a scenario if we're talking about paying for a conservator. Well, the conservator is good friends with the curator. And, you know, they've got 20 people on that staff. And if the curator says that we can sell this painting, well, the conservator can maybe get a raise or get an assistant. you immediately start seeing how conflict of interest comes to play in the field. That is why we've avoided these issues of paying salaries, why we've avoided using those funds for capital campaigns when we have trustees who would like to have a brand new gallery. There are issues out there that we have in the moment of crisis, I think, elided over. So I didn't really give you any answers there other than I would like to see a decision made more broadly within our field that puts the brackets on that.
Thank you. And it was kind of a trick question because there is no concrete answer. So thank you for rising to the occasion, truly. Daniel, happy Mardi Gras. Thank you for joining us. I know you have no power at home, so you get the gold medal for going above and beyond to be part of this conversation this morning. Deaccessions involve a wide range of stakeholders, of course. Some of them that Erik just alluded to, curators, directors, but also development staff, donors, as well as their heirs, assigns, grandchildren, foundations, etc. And of course, boards. These are all of the most obvious players in the arena of deaccessioning and collections management. But artists, community members, gallerists, auction houses, all also have some serious skin in the game on a regular basis. Nested museums, or embedded museums if you prefer, have the additional challenge of working with faculty or senior administrators, sometimes city administrators, who, like other stakeholders, may not always understand the complexities and nuance of best practices for professional museums as they relate to collections management, including provenance and, of course, deaccessioning. Daniel, can you, as the director of LSU's Museum of Art, as well as the prior director at the Polk and other institutions, as Zinnia shared with us this morning, can you talk a bit about the clash of cultures that is often encountered in these circumstances, in addition to perhaps providing advice on how best to navigate the related challenges that come from this clash of cultures?
Thank you, Jill. Well, first off, I want to start with the object itself. And when it's been given to a museum, one of our biggest areas that we have to be very active in is an unrestricted gift of property, the deed itself. If you don't work with the donor in its original basis, objects come in, that's part of where the heirs and others can cause concerns later, where you need to get approval and et cetera. One of the things to recognize with a deaccessioned object in the traditional way, and I still am a strong believer of it, you sell an object to buy an object. It actually is maintaining an object. So if Jill had given an artwork to the LSU Museum of Art and we were to sell it, the next object, instead of being a gift from Jill, would be made possible from a gift from Jill. You maintain that integrity. If the intention was an art object and not operations and not the other things, you go back to a lot of places where that's been an issue. So first off, start with the deed itself. One of the things you've talked about here too is boards. When you do that, the power's at the top. Obviously, whether you're an embedded institution or otherwise. I mean, here at the university, we went through a deaccessioning in the last couple of years of some period rooms. And in that process, we had to take it all the way to the Board of Supervisors for the system to get approval for the potential disposal, which was approved, and we're in the process. That was a very long process. First off, any place you're working, transparency, that word's been, I think, said already, but if you're not using that kind of transparency, if you're not open and listening, I think that some of the museums that have started this process and have withdrawn it is because of public pressure. Well, in a way, you could say that's because they were listening. They might have been listening a little late, or they hadn't really investigated that a little bit more. When we were selling some things at the Hunter Museum, we actually had our curator went to the press and we talked about these objects that we had questionable provenance. We didn't know where they came from in some cases. We had records for them. We went public with it and really talked about what we were doing. The museum had gone from being a diverse museum, if you will, kind of more undefined, to an American art museum, and Asian artworks were not appropriate to the mission. So, mission becomes a driving factor for me in all these cases. How do you focus mission to make your decision? And you have to understand institutions do evolve, like the Hunter Museum became an American Art Museum, and that was a significant change. But the full disclosure and the public release of what we were doing and the asking of questions while we did it, the contacting of donors and heirs, that was all done. So you do want to be very considerate that way. Some museums have gone so far as to close. I know there was the Gulf Coast Museum in Florida. I remember when it ran into financial problems, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. I won't go into. It's just not necessary. But in fact, when it did it, it made a decision to disperse its collection to another institution. It actually reached out to a bunch, and they were really following, the founding of a nonprofit in a state through a Secretary of State, and the dissolution, taking your assets and putting them to other nonprofits. So in that case, they really were careful to make sure the collection stayed in the public sector, even as the facility and the institution had to shut down for, lack of being able to be sustained. All of it was very unfortunate, but the collection stayed public. They chose not to try to sell it all and try to stay open. And they I think, honestly assessed that would have just deferred them down the road more. They just would have run into the troubles a little bit later, right? I mean, it's same troubles, they would have had no art. So in that process, if you think about the unrestricted gifts, all the stakeholders, and you're transparent about it as you follow your policy and are careful about it. I mean, it took us almost 3 years to go through the process for the room sale. And the museum, in our case, had profoundly changed from an Anglo-American art museum to a fine art museum in a different facility. The period rooms are not appropriate anymore for the mission or for the facility or for just the act of the institution, the character of who we are. We went through all of the steps I've described. And frankly, there are some people that love those. We still have the furniture and the paintings that went with them, and we still use those as objects in other kind of settings as a fine art museum and with a decorative collection also. So you just have to really, I think mission should be your guide, your founding documents in terms of your plan and your donor deed. And then you have to be as transparent and public as you can be.
Thank you. That's great. And thanks for providing what sounds like a textbook case of a very healthy de-accession in terms of those period rooms.
Thank you.
Erik, back to you. Just as there is a wide range of stakeholders, even in a typical quote unquote de-accession, there's also a tremendous amount of variety between institutions. Encyclopedic collections and contemporary art museums, for instance, frequently have very different missions, which may impact their institutional views of and commitments to collections stewardship. How would you describe the major differences between such institutions as it relates to collections management, and how does this impact de-accessioning in your view?
Thanks, Jill. So I will say that I think the whole question of de-accessioning has revealed some of the fissures in our field about different approaches to what it is to be a museum. You can break things down in a number of ways, but let's just say there's probably a group of maybe mega museums. They have very large budgets, the Met, hundreds of millions of dollar budgets. You could probably put maybe 20 museums in that category in the United States. I don't know, I don't have a fixed number, but let's say a couple dozen maximum. Then some of those may or may not be contemporary art museums. So you split it between the encyclopedic and then maybe the more modern focused institutions. Within AAMD or within our field, we also have many mid and small size museums. And then we have another category, and these are my own categories. So this is, college and university museums. And in the de-accessioning-ish questions, of course, let's just say the Met can hold their own. So let me just take them and if the Met sells a Roysdale or a Chippendale side chair, really no one is going to notice. It's not going to affect what they're able to do as far as telling a story. They have so many objects that it just really isn't going to affect them. That, however, is not the case for many other institutions. And I think the fear that comes through in all of this process isn't from, I don't think I think the Met is going to be just fine. And, but they are, for better or for worse, the Met, MoMA, Guggenheim, Whitney, Maybe we can add Chicago, Boston, LA. These are some of the Houston, some of the flagship, and what they do then is held up to be the standard for our field, when in fact their needs, their resources are very, very different from the much greater mass of institutions in the country. And I do think that has been lost in some of this discussion. I think more provocatively, there's another split in our world, and that is, so speaking for myself, I'm a historian, art historian, trained, see works of art very much as cultural artifacts that tell us about history, about the human condition. They are these creative wonders. The farther end of this scale would be, it's a commodity. It has a market value, and I think this is something that is threatening some of our contemporary and modern institutions in a way that isn't a threat to maybe more encyclopedic institutions. The values of the market are so high. You know, $60 million for a painting, that is a lot of money. That is a lot of money. And it takes a certain amount of forbearance or spine to say, this has greater value as a cultural, educational, artistic object than it does as an item for sale. And I think that is at play here in a way that has not fully been surfaced in the discussions at all. So you have, again, these mega museum, really big museums. Some of them also, I would say, have the liberty of running large deficits for many years. They're big enough, they can absorb it. I have a $9 million budget. I can't do that. And so I feel in this crisis, some of the issues there are coming out. They're not really being addressed directly, but they're behind the scenes. So again, I think the college and university institutions and the small museums are most vulnerable. I think surprisingly contemporary and modern institutions seem to be most willing. They're less attached to the historic significant. There are intellectual reasons for that. And then there's the big museums. They have so much to sell. They love the art, but they've got 5 of them. So one less isn't going to make a difference. And that's, I don't question the validity of that. So again, I'm answering the question with more things that I think we need to consider. And hopefully I've put a little bit of a frame on it.
Thank you. You have, and I'm sure, I hope that these conversations will continue. I know that they will next month during the 3-day panel that Syracuse, for example, has organized. So I think we're just really beginning to scratch the surface of these very complicated, intertwined questions. I did just want to add to your point, Erik, about the smaller and nested institutions being particularly vulnerable. I agree wholeheartedly. I am a nested institution. The Lowe is part of the University of Miami, but also I've invested a lot of time and energy together with my co-chair for the task force for the protection of university collections, who I know is on this call. Hi, John Wettenhall. Thanks for joining us this morning. But on behalf of AAMG, the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries, John and I have prepared a toolkit, a deaccessioning toolkit, which does not have answers at all, but it provides some guideposts. And that's going to be posted on AAMG's website by the end of the week. So keep an eye out for that. And Zinnia, I will send you the link if you don't mind sharing it through SEMC as well, and perhaps directly to the participants today. But to your point, we are very aware, I think you're spot on in pointing out how different and how much more vulnerable the smaller and/or nested institutions are. Robin, back to you, please. Lately, a great deal of attention has been paid to high-profile deaccessions that promote equity and social justice prospectively. I would like to spend a little time thinking about deaccessions that effect these same ends retroactively. In particular, the removal of objects from museum collections that are known to be stolen, looted, or to have other serious provenance issues. This also extends to material that is unquestionably racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, or otherwise demeaning or degrading to a specific sector of our population. What do you think about that? The idea of correcting or promoting social justice, looking back at the collection rather than towards the future?
Right. Well, that's obviously a very sort of tortuous path that one has to explore. Obviously, we all know that restitution of stolen, looted art is something that all of our institutions have been working on and hopefully fulfilling the obligations there. And that's a kind of no-brainer. But I think where it gets a bit more murky is in terms of works of art that can cause offense in different ways, particularly in terms of thinking about art museums, particularly encyclopedic art museums that have works of art from cultures across the world, many of which were acquired in different times. Most American museums were on a kind of buying spree in the late 19th, early 20th century, and there wasn't that much investigation as to where these works came from, or even they didn't care where these works came from. I mean, if they wanted to build up a collection of African art, they would just go to dealers in Belgium or wherever and acquire it. Likewise, indigenous American art, they would just acquire it and not really think about where it came from. What gradually happened, obviously, in museums is the interpretation of these objects changed. I mean, the days in which museums in this country had the word primitive art above the entrance to a gallery have thankfully long gone, but still that legacy remains, that we have works of art in our collections that have dubious provenances in terms of how they were acquired. And that they weren't exactly stolen, but they were acquired in circumstances that need to be addressed. And I think that as museums, particularly ones that are trying to be encyclopedic, and again, I would return to my earlier point, that is that something that museums should be doing at this time? And should we be reconsidering the focus of the collection? And I think it's overdue that museums look in detail at those collections that came in the past in different circumstances and understand what the outcome is. Merely returning these works of art to the places of origin is also potentially fraught with difficulty, because part of our role as public institutions is to maintain these cultural works in the best circumstances, which takes us back to the care of collections. Is returning a work to the place of origin going to necessarily fulfill that mission of preserving world culture? And so it's an area that's fraught with difficulty, and I don't think that the museum community has really examined it in any more than a superficial way hitherto. But I think that's an area. It's going to be deaccessioning, but it's not deaccessioning to raise money. It's deaccessioning because it's the right thing to do. And I think that's something that needs a longer conversation within the museum community than we've had so far.
Thank you. And Zinnia, there's your next webinar, perhaps, in terms of museum management and collection management. Nancy, I'd like to return to you, please. Social scientists and public policy makers like Michael O'Hare posit that museums sitting on untold piles of high-value art should simply sell a portion of their collections, thereby enabling them to expand their facilities, waive admission fees, and generally serve their audiences more effectively. Anyone who is involved in the running or directing of a museum understands, of course, that it's not quite that simple, not at all. But I would like to hear your thoughts on statements like this, drawn from O'Hare's polemical essay entitled "Museums Can Change, Will They?", which was published in spring 2015 in Democracy. O'Hare writes, quote, "Selling just 1% of the collections by value, much more than 1% by object count, would enable the Art Institute of Chicago to endow free admission forever," close quote. What do you think about his position, Nancy?
Well, it's very interesting and I think provocative question. The AAMD, and some of it has already been addressed in a way, the AAMD opened a can of worms with their, expanding the idea of how deaccessioning funds could be utilized over this 2-year period. Still, the results were to be deployed back to collection care in some way. And the problem, of course, is in how museums have interpreted that. I mean, this has been discussed that some have used the funds to fill in parts of their collection that were lacking, in some cases having to do with artists of color, minority artists, so that they can be more relevant really to the current cultural matrix. And others have used it to hire curatorial collections management staff to expand their facilities so that they can better store their art, and in some cases, programming and outreach. And none of these motives are inherently bad. I think the problem is that it can become a slippery slope, and many people are asking, where will it end? There was one museum director who likened deaccessioning to crack cocaine to an addict, a rapid fix that becomes a dependency. I don't think that really has happened to a lot of museums, but again, it goes back to the question of having carefully delineated procedures and rationales for deaccessioning, so that they're articulated in your collections management policy, and that you follow the who, what, when, and why, so to speak, of doing that. And if it's done carefully and ethically, I don't have any problem with that. I think it's just the problem comes in how people have broadly interpreted the AAMD directive.
Thank you. And I do just want to add, without going into it at any great length or detail at this point, and I hopefully we can return to this during the Q&A, but monetizing collections is, of course, no easy thing. The implications in terms of FASB or GASB are tremendous. It's not just about valuing collections and making the world a better place within the walls of your museum. It's much, much more complicated. But again, hopefully we'll have time to return to that. I think I saw a question related to that in the Q&A.
And Jill, if I could just follow up a little bit, that was why the Weatherspoon established this arts foundation to hold title to the collection so that it could not be monetized. That was in the days of Jesse Helm as a, North Carolina senator. It wasn't, well, it was somewhat after the Mapplethorpe affair, but that's why they did it. So the university could not turn the collection into a new, an asset. School of education.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Daniel, I'd like to return to you, please. The vast majority of American museums that enjoy preferential tax status do so under the educational exempt purpose set out in IRS Code 501c3. There is no exemption for art or art objects, though of course donors can write off their non-cash charitable contribution, that is to say gifts of art, under our tax code. Of course, educational programming and all that entails, from staff to materials and supplies to facilities, requires resources. I cannot help but think about our colleague Glenn Lowry's diagnosis of one of the problems plaguing museums today as being the fact that we are object rich and cash poor in this context. Can you talk a little bit, please, about how these vectors, collection objects, educational commitments, and financial pressures can collide, and what this means in the context of de-accession debates?
Sure, thank you, Jill. First off, the exempt purpose, I want to remind everybody, I think it's, goes without saying, but that we're an object-oriented learning, primary source holders of educational knowledge. And to me, that still is such an important thing of culture and history, and the extent of how art history, you can study any area of inquiry, frankly, from fashion to finance to the history of faith. I mean, so many things. So for me, that exempt purpose is very clear. Glenn can easily say that we're object rich and cash poor. He heads MoMA, a lot more objects than we've been talking about, the medium and mid-side and nested. I mean, we all have a lot of objects, but not like what the Med or MoMA, really what Erik talked about, that top tier of a few that are very different than the rest of us. In terms of, financial pressures, let me just say, I've been in the field long enough to go through the farm crisis, the S&L crisis, the tech bubble, the Great Recession, and now the COVID apocalypse. And I think of all of those and how they affected museums, and the ones I ran into financial difficulties. Had to take out a cash flow loan at one museum to work through a temporary downsizing, if you will, while funds didn't flow when you needed them, and managed to keep that very straightforward, reserved, and paid it back and got out of that position through very careful management and care. So, the financial part, we've all been through it. I think we need to be careful that this moment with this year now of COVID, that we use it as an excuse. The idea that the things are off the books, FASB particularly, I know how hard all of us worked for years to make sure that our art collection doesn't show up on the balance sheet in the way other assets do. I don't want us to get away from that. And I'm fearful that this kind of pressure, and really so much of it is from the top rather than from the bottom, might head that way. So I have real concerns with that. So those, if you talk about the collections, the object education commitments, financial pressures, I mean, we've all had to, at times, I mean, during this period, we've had some downsizing. We've had to go to virtual programming. Our earned income here is down dramatically in terms of attendance, visitation, admissions, store sales, things like that. At the same time, our reach has been pretty good in terms of virtual world, and we're expanding and learning new skills while we're doing it, and we're maintaining. And we will get past this. That's the other thing. I mean, think about the Great Recession. That was significant. I mean, in terms of the scale of it. So often, I think cultural institutions, it could take us 18 months to recover from things like that. The culture and the economy might recover before the donors recover. Now, during this period, we've seen the fact that a lot of people hurting except for the top 1%. So a lot of donors are still there and are still giving. We've been very fortunate here to have support and are getting through, though still stressed every day when I look at the books. But the idea of having objects be monetized scares me from the standpoint of my belief that what William Carlos Williams said, no ideas, but in things. I've always liked that phrase. Bob Dylan said, in the museums where infinity goes up on trial. Both of those quotes, they kind of guide me sometimes. These objects are the things of our lives that are why we're here. But it doesn't mean you don't manage your collection, because you should. And over time, your mission can evolve, and it should. And the social and cultural things that are going on now in our world are beautiful. Colonialism went on too long. It's the foundation of many of our institutions and our collections. So I think we have to call all that into question, but be careful about monetizing the works themselves.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And just for the benefit of our listeners, I have one more formal question for each of our panelists. So 4 more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A that Zinnia has graciously agreed to moderate. So Robin, back to you, please. On October 2nd, 2020, the New York Times published an article entitled, quote, "Baltimore Museum to sell 3 blue chip paintings to advance equity," close quote. I think that this headline, for me, perfectly encapsulates what I see as a false dichotomy that pits people against art. To my mind, we can honor and advance diversity, equity, and anti-racism in our work without deaccessioning high-value works of art. The road to doing so may be longer and more fraught, but such a road does indeed exist. And arguably, by taking this more entrenched path to correcting past injustices, the organizational culture may enjoy more enduring, deeply ingrained value shifts. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think part of the problem with museums is obviously, and to return to my earlier point, is historically American art museums are kind of places of white privilege, and historically always have been. And there's been a great emphasis on changing that. The approach that Baltimore took, I agree, was totally inappropriate, to sell off 3 blue chip works, including the only Clifford Still in the museum, for example. I don't know how they arrived at that decision. I suspect it may have been in collusion with Sotheby's or whatever, but that is not the way forward for museums to achieve equity. And again, to what Daniel said, the people who've been doing well out of our current crisis are the top 1%. And a lot of that top 1% are on the boards of museums. And the need for a museum like Baltimore or any of our other institutions to rebalance the collection and include works of art that are more representative of the community, of the history of the American nation, should be financed by donors, not by selling works of art. There is, as I've said, I mean, there is a necessity to refine the collection. And if that happens to mean that you have a work of art that is very valuable, that doesn't fit in with the mission, sure, that's acceptable and should go ahead in the best ethical and transparent manner possible. But ultimately, to achieve the social equity that museums need to have in the future, I think it's very much a board relationship thing. And in the last few months, I've been working in terms of thinking about strategy for museums. And the one question that comes up all the time in conversations with museum directors is board relations. How do I make my board understand the necessities of the institution, and how do they need to step up to the plate to make that happen? And it's been amazing that of all the needs of organizations strategically that I've been talking to, board relations is the biggie. And that's what everybody's been talking about. And so I think that's an educational proposal that boards need to understand. It's not just a social obligation to be part of a board. It's actually something that you really need to understand what you represent in terms of the organization, and that your support is absolutely critical to making things happen, and monetizing the collection is not the way to go.
Excellent, thank you. And I did see a question to your very point come in from my friend Terry Sultan. Hi, Terry, thanks for joining us. So we'll have a chance to return to boards not really understanding what is best practices, protocols, and acceptable, and how we can, as museum professionals, help to stave off this pressure to monetize, inappropriately monetize collections. Erik, I do actually want to belabor the point of equity and de-accessioning, because I think it's a really important one. I think it lies at the core of many de-accessioning debates that are making the news of late, including Andrew Resseff's February 8th Art News article entitled "As Museums Push to Sell Art, Competing Ideas About De-accessioning Are Playing Out in the Public." He quotes Mark Gold in that article saying, quote, "What's unethical about using proceeds from one painting to pay people fairly or to address social injustice," close quote. I fear that this remark, made in the context of AAMD's aforementioned April 2020 resolution, conflates the ethical considerations governing de-accessioning with urgent social justice commitments into which the overwhelming majority of US museums are investing themselves in every sense of the word. It's certainly not unethical to pay people fairly or to address social injustices, quite the contrary. But in my opinion, that does not mean that it is ethical to sell works that do not otherwise meet criteria for de-accessioning under the CMP to achieve these ends. Erik, what are your thoughts?
So I think I'm probably not so far from you, Jill, in some of these things. I think there are a couple things I'd like to point out. We are in a moment, at least, it may be an era in which many of the uncomfortable historical realities of the field are being revealed more openly through social media and through activism of various sorts that I think is a very valuable, could be hard. You know, I think many of us, why did we get into this field? Why are we want to be in a museum or teaching people? We're mortified to be associated with some of those realities. So I think we're very uncomfortable with that, and we want to distance ourselves from that history. Understandably so. But I don't believe, and I think this is you're alluding to, that selling works of art is an intelligent way to address this problem. I do not think that the market is the answer to our problems. I really don't. And in fact, I think the contemporary art market might be seen as a indirect cause of some of our problems, if you will. We could talk about that another day. Furthermore, I think we have in our field, as we know, as much as we might have difficulty with trustees, we also have some very ambitious, what I like to call the alpha directors. We want to do things. We want to build buildings. We want to make a name for ourselves. We want to establish our careers, or or do something. And so selling those works of art can be very appealing as a way to achieve those issues, those goals very, very quickly. However, if it's a question of ethics, I think there are some other ethical issues that have not been brought up. One is that we've accepted works of art or acquired works of art with the idea that we will be custodians of those, we will take care of them, and that we will interpret them and present them to the public. That we are public institutions, that we are serving a public good, and that we have taken this on as part of a public trust. So I think it is unethical to betray your public trust to achieve some of these other goals. And I wouldn't even say that just has to be on questions of social justice. I think more broadly, there's some questions in our field. I think what we need to do also then is, if this is our vision of growth and change something that we can afford, right? That's a hard question. Are we using art to make up for a failure to administer properly? I think that's another question. And as much as we would like to achieve important goals of greater equity in our museum, who is not working on that today? Think about the issues in our field of equality and diversity. I think that to say, oh, I'll sell this painting and that'll take care of it because then I'm going to have this new position, and that is not the hard work that we need to do. We need to have a greater reckoning, a greater examination. I think it's going on, and that is going to take more time. It'll be less splashy, and it may be less appealing to all of us. It's in the news. It's happening every day. We have to stand up to that, and I don't think a quick fix is going to be the answer.
Thank you. And that's the perfect bridge to my final question for you, Nancy. Though trust, capital T, as a legal construct does not figure into the typical deaccessioning case, which may come as a surprise to some people, but it doesn't. Lowercase trust certainly does. What do you see as the primary issues involving notions of public trust? And Erik just alluded to some of them when it comes to museum collections and their management, including deaccessions.
I think the idea of public trust has become so ensconced that it doesn't surprise me that the public might be, if not outraged, at least quite disturbed by deaccessioning going on in their in museums that they support or participate in. But Daniel, I think, did something very good at the Hunter Museum when the curator came out with a press release explaining what they were doing and why they were doing it. Because I think the public doesn't often know what deaccessioning even means. And I think an effort like that to educate them is very, very important. You know, of course, public trust implies that museums will abide by donor intention and adhere to established guidelines in the field. The idea becomes more complicated in the face of collectors and the art market. You know, when works go to either direct sale at galleries or to auction, the fact that they have been in museum collections gives them an imprimatur, which inevitably increases their value. You know, I think about, I don't get the catalogs anymore. I don't even know if Christie's is producing them, but I think of the Christie's catalogs that used to come out with pages and pages of essays about particular objects and comparing them to other objects and, you know, trying to make the case for why this particular piece was so important, all in the effort of raising the ultimate value of it. But museums bear the burden of clarifying the donor's intent. And sometimes that's not always easy. The ideal situation, of course, is to not have any strings attached to contributions, be they works of art or financial for that matter, unless it's given specifically for a purpose, such as an endowment. But I think you try to avoid any strings attached to a gift. And it's really the curator and the director's role to sort that out. And if there are any issues, to talk to the donor directly, explain your position, and if need be, turn an offer down. I mean, at the Weatherspoon, we had to do that at times because there were strings attached. Somebody wanted to have this Calder textile hung all the time in one position in the museum, and we just had to say no. We're not going to commit ourselves to that. So it's a situation that can require a lot of diplomacy and tact and hopefully goodwill on both parts.
Thank you. And you raise a very good point that I know everyone on this panel and probably many on the call can appreciate, which is saying no is one of the hardest parts of our jobs, but it's an absolutely essential component to good museum management. So thank you for raising that point. Daniel, last but certainly not least, the final question is for you. What do you consider to be the missing link in the deaccessioning debate? I know there's several, but if you had to point to the most significant missing link, what would it be? What guideline or definition or professional practice mandate do you feel would help to clear these murky waters?
I feel like I need to be an anthropologist looking for the right monkey. Well, missing link in my mind, what we really, a word, I don't know if we've used it too much today, but values. I think that needs to be a stronger guide to what we do. Going to, combine that with things that just was said by the last two speakers, both Erik and Nancy, public trust. Trust is a very big word. And I think it's one of the most important words. That's why they're called trustees, because they hold trust. They only represent a community. They don't act independently. They act as a group. They act as a body that's supposed to represent. For museums, in perpetuity is a very long time. Think about that. That's what we're supposed to hold these objects in perpetuity. Well, history is a judge, and if we aren't guided by proper values, and our timeline needs to be longer than today. Again, I went through that list of all the financial crises, and every museum I was at, different effects all of them had, and never positive, at the start. But you get through them. I think that Erik said something about the need for proper management, administration, administer the situations. We're in very tough times, but don't do the short-term gain for the long-term loss. I think that we have to be very careful about that. And I even described one museum, and I know there are museums closing. There's been estimates very high as to the number of them that might during this period. Well, I hope they all process their dissolution properly, disperse their objects to organizations that can maintain and care for the things they hold, because frankly, sometimes that has to happen. But I don't think we should use this emergency as an excuse to misbehave. And I think, again, I go back to values. What does the culture value? How do you define it for your institution? And we're in a time of social justice. One of the things we control is what we put on exhibit, in terms of percentage on display and representation, and how the institution is seen and who sees themselves on the walls represented. That becomes very critical to diversify and build out the collections that have built over for decades or centuries. Is going to take a lot longer by percentage, but what we present, how we do exhibits, how we write, has to represent the shift of values. And I think art museums are on the cutting edge of believing in that. That diversity is a plural, but it's also an actuality, and it's a good thing. That we give bridges to other cultures for people to see through other people's eyes of difference. Through history and period and contemporary versions. And we need to prioritize that and bring that up and not be afraid to. But watch your values and watch short-term gain, because it's long-term loss and it can be irretrievable.
Thank you. And I think that's the perfect place to end our discussion and open it up to the wider audience through the Q&A with Zinnia.
Just want to say thank you all for your very direct and candid answers. I think these conversations are so important to bring the discussion out into the open and allow just a dialogue, an open dialogue as this continues to evolve. So we have a significant number of questions. Thank you all for putting them in the Q&A. We do have about 20 minutes left for those who can stay on. And just to remind, we will be recording this. So if you have to jump off and move on, you can watch it later. But I'm going to start with this one actually, because it's just one that I haven't heard for a while. From John Wettenhall, what is the difference between direct care and indirect care? Who wants to jump in on that one?
I'll take a stab at it. I don't think there's a formula, but one of the formulas that I find, or guidelines that I find very useful, takes me back to my law school days. And in tort law and in criminal law, there's the but-for test. But for whatever you did, Zinnia, whatever I experienced. So, but for the direct care mandate for this object, would I need a curator? Would I need conservation? You know, I think tightening or trying to find out how close the nexus is between what you're considering and the mandate, the end that you're trying to fulfill or uphold is really important. So can I, or you know, but for this mandate, could I maintain an object in perpetuity, to Daniel's point, without conservation resources, without HVAC, without a curator? And oftentimes it's going to be a percentage, right? The curator or the conservator rather is going to be responsible for a whole range of objects, an entire portfolio. And I personally don't have a problem with assigning percentages. It's not perfect, it's a little cumbersome, but trying to figure out, you know, is it 20% of this person's job that is supporting the direct care of our permanent collection objects? Is it 50%? I think that for me, at least, that's the start of something resembling clarity and concrete answers.
Anyone else?
Well, when
I
John
guess I would add only that for our purposes, we have a very narrow, right now in our plan, a very narrow view of what is direct care. And that is things like the materials that it would take to conserve a work, whatever that might be that the conservators use, mats, frames, and really not a whole lot more other than that is what we have for direct care. Other people have a broader definition.
John asked about indirect care, and that could be any expense in the institution. So I'm more like Erik. You know, direct care is direct care, and we should pay attention. Institution exists because there's administrative overhead, which I guess is indirect care, John. But I think we got to be, again, cautious. Slippery slope, as Nancy said earlier.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to a question from Graham Betcher. This is less about direct care and deaccessioning and more about having policies in place that would provide funds for direct care on the front end. Do any of your institutions have policies that require that a percentage of all funds donated for acquisitions be allocated for the care and feeding of collections? We are presently considering such a measure in Birmingham. Erik?
So when we do purchases anyway, we do figure into the cost of the work, what will be the direct care costs of that work, and allocate those from acquisitions funds for that. It's a pretty narrow thing, but it is part of our calculations, yes.
And I would add to that in my experience at my institutions, acquisitions endowments did tend to have some leeway in terms of care of collections, that acquiring a work of art and then having to mat or frame or whatever, that came out of the same acquisitions fund. It wasn't purely dedicated to the work of art. So I think that's fairly common in my experience in museums.
We have the wisdom of one of our donors that established an acquisition fund and specifically says the money can also be used for the care of the objects bought with that fund. It's very, very specific to the founding of that endowment.
Can I just add that we have experimented, and I will confess that it has failed entirely. When accepting gifts in kind, works of art from donors, not large collections, but a single object or maybe just 2 or 3, we have asked them to consider making a cash gift equivalent to 10% of the appraised value. And that actually tends to track quite well with projected storage conservation over the life forever of the object. And consistently, the efforts or the request has been rebuffed. And I think that goes back to not any ill intention on the part of any single donor, but a lack of understanding. And I do think that there needs to be a field-wide commitment to asking those uncomfortable, let's be honest, uncomfortable questions when you're getting a beautiful object, to ask for cash on top of it. It is difficult sometimes. But if we all as a field committed to asking those uncomfortable questions as part of a broader education campaign, I think it would serve our needs, again, as a field in the long run, much, much better.
And I think, again, it goes back in a way to the public trust and to educating people about what is actually entailed in either accessing or de-accessioning a work of art. But the accessing is important as well.
Thank you all. So this next question is from Jennifer Finkel. What if a donor expressed that it is their hope and wish that their collection stay together? Is a hope or wish enough not to break up the collection and de-accession those objects that no longer meet the mission or are damaged beyond repair?
Yeah, I'll say, I think hope and wish is pretty loose language, and that you should feel free to make the choices that you need. I mean, talk to your lawyer, but I think it's not, if the document doesn't say a clear expectation or a requirement, they're giving you leeway to act if necessary to do that. I mean, I would say that language is pretty open.
Hope and wish doesn't sound like a very good legal term.
No.
But I do think it is a recipe for rocky relations, right? To go back to the notion of trust, they are entrusting or trusting you, your institution, to abide by their hopes and their wishes. But this also, of course, goes back to a point that Daniel raised, which is it's best museum practice to not accept gifts of art with any restrictions. And this is in the penumbra, but you know, you wouldn't want to accept it with any restrictions. I think it's even more perilous to accept it with this vague kind of language, because you're setting yourself up for really unpleasant conversations, or your successor, with the donor and or the heirs and assigns. I would clear up that language immediately, even if it means that you have to go through a lengthy process of getting them away from the restriction that they're trying to impose in the gift. It's contrary to best practices.
And I also think, Jill, that, I mean, part of the problem we've been seeing recently with de-accessions is it's the kind of low-hanging fruit that is getting there. The works of art that don't have restrictions on them are the easiest to dispose of. And that is not a good means of collections management, of just saying, well, this work doesn't have any restrictions, so we can sell it without having to consult the family of the owners or whatever. And I think we've seen a lot of that in the last few years, and I think that's been part of the problem.
Thank you, Robin. I'm going to move on to this next question because I'm sure there are many who would like to hear your answers. Can you all talk about how to manage conversations with trustees who are hell-bent on monetizing the collection to cover general operating and don't mind censure or bad publicity?
First off, you hope it's not more than one.
Get some allies.
Yeah.
Get some allies on the board. Show them examples of how bad it is when some of these things happen to some of these institutions. I've been in a place where something was very seriously considered, which was one of the masterpieces of the work. This was before I arrived. It caused such an incredible dissension within the board and within the institution, incredibly demoralizing. So I think I don't know. That person maybe shouldn't be on your board.
I think also it's a teaching exercise, because a lot of board members are collectors in their own personal right. And so they kind of see buying a work of art and then disposing of it 5 years later as part of the normal way the world works. And they see the museum that they are now integral in as a trustee should operate potentially in the same way, that if a work of art isn't kind of earning its keep, as it were, then we should get rid of it. And that is something that I think as a field, we need to think more clearly about. How do we educate the board in understanding the public trust of the museum and why we exist and what we do? And I think that's one of the big issues right now, from my perspective.
I think also there's some difference between university boards and the boards of standalone nonprofits, because again, in the case of many museums, there's an expected or required financial commitment on the part of the trustees to the institution on an annual basis, which I think can lead to them thinking, well, I've put all this investment in, so I should really have a say. I should be able to, really be involved in the day-to-day operations or whatever, wherever they go with that. But I think that's an issue.
Can I just jump onto that? I think it's onto something important there more broadly. And although we do look to our trustees to solve all of our financial problems, and you should pay more, and there probably are some. I wish I had more on my board who I could say, can you write a check and solve any of my problems? I don't really have people like that have that deep pockets. And I think that there too, going to trustees can be its own issue of a quick fix. Are you the right size? Can you actually maintain yourselves at what you're going to do? I mean, in a place where I live, my community, I have to think that way. Can we really support that kind of growth? And we can grow and we can do more, but we have to think very clearly about what we can manage and not get ourselves overextended. And many institutions, I think, around the country have gotten themselves overextended to the great chagrin of their subsequent directors. Somehow the director who incurs that debt doesn't seem to be around when the bills come due. Sorry, that's another topic. You can see, I told you I wasn't going to get on my soapbox about this, but I did. Sorry.
Zinnia, could I just add? I think this question raises a really interesting problem. It's a problem, which is the fiduciary duties of care, obedience, and loyalty of the standalone boards. They have that legal obligation, and sometimes it doesn't square with best professional practices. Now, I would be the last person, or in that last cohort of people, to advocate for monetizing collections for the sake of generating capital and revenue. But I do think it's important to recognize that duty is there, and I would concur with Robin in particular that it's about education. Make sure they understand why it's a problem. Make sure they understand that it is contrary to best professional practices, and try to keep it not adversarial but productive. But it is also really, I think, critically important to remember where they're coming from, and this duty that they have as a trustee of the standalones in particular to put the best interests, the fiduciary duties that they carry as well.
Thank you, Jill. This next question is more specific to university museums, but I think there are a lot of attendees representing that sector. Would others on the call recommend university museums establish a separate foundation to hold the collection, like in the Weatherspoon's case, to avoid the GASB requirement to place a financial value on collection holdings?
I can say that that's a very common practice. Our collection was with the foundation and actually has moved to the university. And it's because of art insurance needs. It was actually better policy and program there. But one of the things that also was struck is that there is a state law now in Louisiana that if we are to sell something, first off, we got to go through the normal process all the way through to the Board of Supervisors, and that the proceeds are to benefit the collection and acquisitions. It actually says that in the state law. So by being in the state side of things now, we're protected. If you can't get something like that done, having them as a separate one, as long as you maintain control. You know, there has been friends groups that have gone rogue. I can tell you that. I've heard stories, and I've even remember one that tried. So you got to be a little bit careful how they're established and what their articles of incorporation and such say. But it can be a smart way to go.
Okay.
I would
Thank you.
just add, I don't have experience in this. I've not been at an institution with a foundation that holds the collection, but I would just want to remind everybody that AAM, as part of its reaccreditation process for nested or embedded institutions, including college and university museums, does require a letter, for what it's worth, a letter from ideally the president, confirming in writing that the collection will not be monetized. So if setting up this separate foundation for whatever reason is not an appropriate avenue for your organization, just keep in mind that you do have admittedly the soft protection of AAM, but it's there. If you are seeking accreditation or want to stay accredited, it's there.
Jill, I can say actually also hearing that when we were doing our process, reminding them that we want to remain accredited. And for university, accreditation means a lot of its subparts as well as the institution itself. So it did have some strength. So I would encourage you, if you're not accredited, to fight for that because it does have strength.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes and lots of questions, so we'll try and get to a few more. So from another attendee, do museums have an obligation to offer up de-accessioned objects back to the heirs first before selling at auction? Yes, Erik.
So maybe not. I think that contrary to what that might be, that you shouldn't. If you have free and clear title to that, sending it back to the heirs is probably not the way to go, and selling it publicly is the right way to go. You could inform them that this is happening, and they could do that. But I think that there are many ethical issues that go into that. We have, I can say, just gone through some difficult deaccessioning of lost cause memorabilia and things that we had here in this collection that entered who knows how. I think there are probably plenty of other Southern museums that have things like this, medals or things of reunions of veterans and things we would never show. Sometimes we even knew that family that was coming from where it was coming from, excuse me, but I think we informed the heirs that we were doing this, which wasn't always the easiest, but we could not send it back to them.
And I think informing the heirs or the donors, whichever, is really due diligence. I think that has to be part of the process. Yeah,
if you can find them.
Okay, thank you.
Thinking about one of the other questions, did you consider trying to transfer them to a museum that might interpret them right? Because I worry, lost cause items getting into the hands of some of the cultural factors. I don't want that in a way.
Well, I didn't mention that, but that's exactly what we did. We did not put them back out onto the market. We had a lot of things. Some things that were not lost cause that went to the market, and I should have been clear. They went to archives and historical museums that are really working on interpreting that material in a way that was kind of out of our mission, I have to say.
Weatherspoon did that too.
So thank you. In the interest of your time and everyone's time, we're going to do 2 more questions, and I think there probably needs to be a round 2 to get to the rest of them. My mind is already thinking. So this question from Laura Shivo. Robin started with a really important question about the ethics. She said, if I can put words in his mouth, of the assumption of the prioritization of museums as storehouses. No one else has taken up that question. Can someone address the possibility that there might be ethical priorities other than storing unexhibited and sometimes unseen collections in perpetuity?
And I'll just weigh in immediately on that, because I saw another question about the attempted redefinition of museums by ICOM a while back. And I think the priority of that was to say that museums are essentially sort of social institutions rather than art gathering institutions. And I think that was an extreme, which there was a sort of big sort of blowback against. But ultimately, I personally believe that museums should reconsider their role in society and whether the ongoing acquisition of objects and works of art is our primary mission, or whether we should step back for a while, maybe, and just say that's the sort of kind of, it looks good. The trustees love acquiring works of art. I mean, it's all great, but ultimately we have huge collections which we're not showing. So maybe we should reconsider our mission in that context and think about what the collection represents.
Can I jump in as well on a couple things that Robin just said? So we should not be warehouses. If you have no intention of showing the work, and we started out by saying deaccessioning is part of the normal business of a museum, and you should. That said, we all know that sometimes the numbers are filled with things that are objects that are fragile, that are cannot be exposed, cannot be displayed on a regular basis. Photography, drawings account for a huge number of objects in many collections. So there are, you know, like I say, it's complicated. It's not simple to just say that. And at the same time, Robin, I think, says, do we need to be so voracious? Well, we are trying to rebalance our collections, if we will, or look at parts of history that hadn't been addressed. So it has to be done in a way that's be done in a way that's thoughtful, and maybe not the vacuum approach that has sometimes seemed to be the operating principle in some of the largest museums.
But Erik, would you say that a sort of tactical deaccessioning like Baltimore attempted to fill gaps in that collection is a potential way to go, if you're thinking?
I think, you know, again, poor Baltimore, but we all know there were two rounds. There was a first round in which a number of works were sold that were, if not duplicative, they felt they could really tell the story, and I would say the consensus was they could, and use those funds to buy other works of art. Also, another institution that's been that has been up for ridicule lately, SF MoMA, sold some major works of art so that they could have funds to buy works by people of color and artists and women and artists who were not so well represented in their collections historically. I think many of us would be we would encourage that approach. So it can be used, again, as part of a plan, thoughtful plan. That's what we're hoping for.
Baltimore's first one wasn't questioned the way its second one was, because maybe it was not as thoughtful.
I think there was also a question, and here's another dirty word in our field today, or of quality. That the quality of the works that were up in the second time, their unique nature and their importance seem to go beyond that nature of, oh, well, we have 3 of these. I have whatever. I wish I were in this case. I have 5 Picassos. I can sell one, make $20 million, and buy a whole slew of other things that will help me tell a broader story or a different story, or adhere to, or help us create narratives that our current collection won't allow us to do.
And I think, Daniel, it's important to not forget that one of the real issues with the Baltimore scenario is that it was the proposed use of proceeds, right? So they weren't talking about replenishing the collection. What was proposed was something entirely different that I think many felt really stretched the definition of direct care.
Yeah, for sure. That's another.
I agree.
We could spend a whole session on that one too, but there are a lot of issues there about what happened in that second sale that, you know, put all the hairs on the back of our neck going up like, so.
Okay, so I'm gonna end with this final question from Bill Island, and it's sort of a where do we go from here type of question. So I would ask each of you just a final word comment, but Bill's question is, should professional practices in art museums be changed to come more in line with AAM standards for deaccessioning, even though AAMD's standard has traditionally been seen as the highest standard? Who wants to start?
It's a good question, Bill. This is the slippery slope question. If AAMD's is higher, how come it's not? And that's something AAMD is going to have to wrestle with all of the controversy. And I hope that, you know, the leadership is.
Erik.
Or Jill. Jill.
Nope.
No, go ahead, Jill.
I would, first of all, hi, Bill. Thanks for that great, very hard question. I expect nothing less of you. I think that really the pinch point for me, or as I see it, is direct care. That's really where we keep stumbling. And so if there could be some shared agreement, and I saw that somebody, I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, but somebody did call to our attention in the chat. I think that there is a direct care matrix that AAM has on its website, but yep, thank you. But so there's the white paper and the matrix. So look at those. But I think that if there could be some shared understanding of direct care, a lot of these problems would solve themselves in effect. So I wouldn't advocate necessarily for AAMD and AAM to be in lockstep, in no small measure because AAM represents a much, much broader field of collecting bodies. But I do think there needs to be some shared understanding, not necessarily a definition, but an understanding of what we mean when we say direct care, and just as importantly, what we do not mean.
And I'll add that I think AAN is important because it is the reaccreditation agency, not AAMD.
And also, I mean, I would add, I think the challenge is that AAM obviously encompasses a huge variety of museums, not just art museums, whereas AAMD is a pretty select organization. And there are many art museums, and I saw a comment earlier about the fact that there are many university art museums that aren't part of AAMD, and so their sanctions don't really have any weight. I think it's probably up to a combination of AAMD and AAM to revisit their deaccessioning guidelines and try to get in sort of on the same plane in many ways, which I don't think they are at the moment, and that's partly what's causing the confusion.
I would add, I would hope in that discussion we would get into something that I alluded to earlier, and that is, how do we feel about what artworks are? And are they commodities? Or is it like the stuffed emu? You know, I mean, just this thing we have. So I would argue that we need to look more carefully and calmly at the pitfalls of selling works of art. That said, you know, if you have 2 million works of art in your collection, there's probably some things you can do with that. You're in a very different state. So it goes back to that question that we may need to have. I don't know. I think we need to be a little more deliberative than we have been in the past. And what seemed to be okay in the 1990s isn't doing the trick. It's not doing the trick for everybody today. And yeah, so.
Thank you, Eric. I think that's a great place to end. Really, thank you for all of your time, for the couple hundred of you who are on this call listening and asking great questions. Jill, fantastic moderator. I may call on you again to do it. Nancy, Eric, Daniel, Robin, thank you for, again, your candor and your direct answers.
Happy Mardi Gras.
Happy Mardi Gras. Important conversations to be had. Hopefully we will put together a part 2. Obviously, there's still many questions we didn't get to in the chat, and we will continue to come up with ways to address this topic. So that's it. SEMC will have another program at the end of March. I don't have that particularly scheduled yet, but I'm working on it. So stay tuned. Thank you for being with us, and everybody have a great week.